Good afternoon and welcome to Real Life. I'm Jackie Allison, and I have with me today as my guest Dr. Philip McMillan. He's with the NHS in the UK. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Not only are you a medic, but you are very active in research and active also on LinkedIn. And so it'd be a wonderful opportunity for your followers to get to know you a little better through this interview. So maybe we could start off with you telling us a bit about your background.
So essentially, I am from the West Indies in that I grew up in the West Indies. I trained in the West Indies, and I've been in the United Kingdom for over 20 years now. And I'm what you would describe as a generalist or a physician with a general interest in medicine. And it is out of that work that I have been focused for over 10 years on dementia and dementia research. And that's primarily because of the experience that I had with my own mum, who died from dementia. And at the time, I had struggled to do anything. And I promised that I would try and make a difference for others. And so I've been working at that with hopefully solutions for the future.
Wonderful. And could you tell us then, how did you make that pivot from dementia research into COVID research?
Well, at the time, it was purely and simply about the fact that I recognized that there was something unusual about the disease. And I thought that the approach that I had in terms of dementia research would be quite useful or valuable in trying to understand the issues around COVID-19. And so quite early in February, just late January, February, I started to focus my approach on how to try and see if we could understand this quite devastating disease.
What was it that stood out to you about COVID that piqued your interest that something was different about this?
Well, it was primarily due to the fact that there were some quite unusual features that were coming out of China early on. And I had seen especially the fact that up to 76% of the people who were affected with COVID-19 were hypertensive. I thought that was very, very strange. And so I started to look at it from a different angle because I was thinking that hypertension as a primary cause of the disease or primary association did not fit with what I would expect from a normal average viral infection. So that was one of the things that stood out. The other thing that stood out was when the disease had hit Italy. And I realized that the description from one of the Italian doctors was that all of the chest x-rays looked similar. And I found that very, very significant because very rarely in a normal infection can you have where it's only one part of or you'd expect separate parts of the lung to be affected in different ways. This was a very, very specific pattern, which looked like a more systemic response.
Okay, and so what did you foresee when you started looking at COVID? What did you think that would have into in terms of the global situation?
I picked up quite early that the biggest challenge would be with our elderly or vulnerable elderly. And I remember writing a short paper on strategies that I thought could have been used within the care homes. At that time in the UK, we hadn't yet come to the conclusion that we were going to do any lockdown. And so the strategy was herd immunity. And what I recognized was that with a 14.8% mortality in the over 80s, what that could mean is up to 60,000 deaths in that group of people. So what I was saying was that we should come up with a strategy that would reduce the risk of those individuals in care homes from acquiring serious disease.
Yeah, that was a very major impact. And as we can see, there has been a huge impact on the care homes. So how did this lead you into sort of the activity that you had on LinkedIn? Or you have talked to a number of experts. How did you end up and what did you learn from those interviews?
Yeah, so that was quite a process in terms of what I got. And because I have the ability to interview people on LinkedIn, and I thank you for interviewing me. What I then did was as I was doing the research, I first came across a Professor Shi in China. And because that was where the disease was primarily concentrated, I thought it would be quite interesting to speak with him. And so I managed to get him on one of these LinkedIn interviews. And he had put forward a very, very significant point, which was that he was an immunologist and he reckoned that the reason that we had so much severe lung disease was because the inflammatory process in the lungs was producing a very gel-like substance called hyaluronic acid, which would mean that there would be no way for oxygen to get through. And I think that on balance, this is sounding as though it probably was true. So it was quite a remarkable concept from him.
Wonderful, yes. And there have been others that you have talked to over time. What would you say are some of the highlights of those conversations?
Yeah, so I then continued that journey. I remember speaking with Professor Laderut in Canada. I also spoke with Professor Chris Newton in the United Kingdom, and he had put me on to another professor in Ireland who had really put our opinions together with regards to how to test for an unusual feature of COVID. I then had the privilege of being introduced through a Professor Ruud Bernstein in Michigan. After that interview, he had mentioned that I should probably speak with Professor Uhao. So it was almost a progressive climb up a ladder, getting to more and more experts. And when I got on to Professor Uhao, he is the internationally recognized top expert on pulmonary ACE2, which is what the virus uses to get into lung cells. So I thought, wow, what an opportunity. And I took the chance of throwing out the idea that we could work together in doing a paper, and he thankfully agreed.
Yes, wonderful. So that was published, was it back in May?
Yeah, so that was published in May, and that was focused on the concept of autoimmunity in COVID-19 as the primary mechanism of the disease. And this is along the line that I had said previously, that I always believe that you have to find the primary pathology in order to be able to understand the disease.
So I think your work now, you've published, you were probably the first out there or close to on autoimmunity in COVID. As a thought leader, then, what are some of your findings, or what's happening next in that arena?
Yeah, so what I'll say quickly about this, because it is quite a large area, but I'll mention that it is quite a straightforward concept that in this image here, we have multiple diseases that are triggered by viruses. And all of these are examples of autoimmune diseases. You have multiple sclerosis, you have SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, immune thrombocytopenia, type 1 diabetes, and the list goes on. And so the concept that you can have autoimmune mediated disease in the context of COVID-19 is not far-fetched. The question is, what is it about this that makes it different? And that's where I had found the association with hypertension and heart disease. And what I recognized was that the only way that you can have a difference, I shouldn't say the only way, but one of the ways that you can have a different targeting by the virus is because of soluble ACE2. Now, very few people know much about it, but essentially, on the surface of these cells, these endothelial cells in the lung, you have the ACE2 enzyme. And if it gets cut off by other enzymes, it floats in the serum. And there are higher levels in patients with hypertension and heart disease. And in that context, it's an unusual feature. And we don't fully know why this happens, but we know that it is a part of what happens in hypertension and heart disease. And this
So
is
you're
what
seeing that connection between higher levels of ACE2 in the serum for patients with hypertension and heart disease. And that's what you're following up on.
absolutely. And so because of that, that's where it leads to the concept of autoimmunity. And I've got a simple diagram here that will hopefully capture the thought, which is that if that soluble ACE2 combines with the virus and gets taken up by a white blood cell, the white blood cell can't differentiate between the spike protein on the virus and the ACE2. And it's likely that not only will it produce antibodies to the spike protein, but also antibodies to ACE2. And then critically, when we look at what happens between ACE and ACE2, you have an overlap between the two of them. And what that could mean is that not only are antibodies formed against the ACE2 enzyme, but also the ACE, which is spread right throughout the lung and could explain why we have such a severe inflammatory response in the lung.
So what you mean by overlap is in terms of the morphology between ACE and ACE2, similarities, sufficient similarities that it's hard to distinguish, or maybe the autoimmune system can't differentiate and it's attacking both.
Absolutely, that is exactly right. And then because there is a 40% overlap between the ACE and the ACE2 enzymes, what can then happen is that autoantibodies, if they are produced against ACE2, can also target ACE, which would be quite a serious reaction, which is probably what we do see in the context of the patients who died on intensive care.
So you're thinking then that this theory of autoimmunity can help to explain not just the lung issues, but a number of other symptoms that come with COVID.
Oh, absolutely. We've put together a second paper, which is currently under review at the moment, which I've done with Professor Uhal again. And in that second paper, what we're trying to delineate is exactly why you have all of the symptoms associated with COVID-19. And when you put it under the umbrella of autoimmunity, it makes perfect sense. And this is where it links to the dementia research that I have been doing. The principle is very simple. In order to understand the disease, sometimes the best approach is to identify outlying symptoms or things that don't make sense. When you have identified them, if you can get them into an understanding of the disease, that's where you really get close to an answer. And in the context of autoimmunity, this is what would allow it to be able to pull all the symptoms that we're seeing together under one umbrella.
Yes, well, good luck with the work. We hope that you do help to find solutions. The pandemic is still here. People are dying. The numbers are high, quite disturbing. What do you see happening next then?
Well, one of the privileges that I had over the past few months, other than writing the paper with Professor Uhal, is that we had the privilege of hearing from Professor Townsend in Oxford. Now, he is one of the top researchers in the world, certainly in terms of influenza. And when he mentioned to us that he had also written a paper on autoimmunity, we knew that there's a pretty good chance that what we're doing here could be breakthrough. That was an absolutely high moment. Even coming up, we're hoping to try and share some of the work with him, but I'll mention at the end the relevance of what we're doing in terms of how Professor Townsend does help in terms of his research in Oxford. So they are looking at it as well.
Wonderful. Well, I wish you all the best in your research. Any last thoughts that you'd like to add before we wrap it up for today?
Yes, well, I think that the primary thing that I want to say is that after a few more meetings, and we've had the pleasure of speaking with people all over the world, and there are lots of scientists who are doing work on this, who are trying to make a difference in COVID-19. So we had spoken to Dr. Jean Amiral in France, who also is looking very closely at autoimmunity and hopefully going to be testing for that quite soon. And so next week, we are planning to have a conference of some of the leading thinkers around COVID-19 and autoimmunity. So we'll have Professor Uhal, there will be myself, and there will be Dr. Amaral. I was hoping to get Professor Townsend from Oxford as well, but he is very clear. He doesn't really like social media, but also he made it clear that until we've gotten concrete results, he does not want to talk publicly about this, but it is very, very important. So next week, we're hoping to have a simple conference with the 3 or maybe 4 of us to share further ideas about the work that can be done and the kind of help that is needed in the long term to find answers for COVID-19.
Well, that's very exciting work, and I do hope you find the support that you need to continue this. The answers are critical. As we said, the pandemic is ongoing. We do need answers. We need to save lives. So thank you very much for sharing that with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you, learn more about you, and hopefully your followers will appreciate getting to know you, their influencer, better. So thank you for coming, and thank you all for joining us on Real Life. We look forward to seeing you again at our next interview. Thank you, Dr. McMillan.
Thank you.